Hi, I'm Thane.
And I'm Crispy, and we're here to let you know about the Death and Decay zine, which will be launching on Kickstarter on February 21st.
It's a new art zine featuring illustrations that explore the melancholic beauty of decay and rot.
Featuring work by over 15 artists, some of whose work you may already know.
Check it out at sevensmith.net/ddzine.
Thank you, and enjoy the show. Bow, bow. We're going to go so far. It's going to be a
Woo.
good, sexy ep.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about content warnings and ratings. I'm Crispy, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the webcomics Ghost Chung Sickness and Lunar Blight.
Hi, I'm Miranda. I make the webcomic Into the Swell, and my pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the webcomic Somnolus.
So, we've got all different types of stories to tell, and we want to make sure that we are reaching the audiences we want to reach. Movies and games have official rating systems that could be adapted for comics, and content warnings are another way to flag when someone might have phobic content or other potentially triggering stressors. But how do we apply these tools helpfully and respectfully? It can be pretty challenging. That's why we're going to talk about it today. So, of course, like we always do, I'm going to be starting with a question. And this one I'm going to be throwing you at you, Miranda. So, what rating do you give your comic when people ask, and how do you broadcast it to your potential audience?
So, my comic I consider as young adult, and I don't have any clear content warnings on my site because the way my comic starts off, it kind of is the darkest it's going to get. And so it kind of sets an expectation that there is some character violence and some darker moments. And I feel like because I set that expectation from the get go, nothing will really come as a surprise to readers later on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that, as long as you're setting the expectation, then you don't have. Sorry, I realize the thing I wrote down is very redundant.
That's a really good thing, though, because we've kind of touched on that a bit in the aesthetics episode, where you talk about like things that draw in audiences and whatnot. And having that expectation, like you said, like Into the Swell starts with like that scene where someone's gonna get hung,
Yeah,
and it's just like,
it's pretty
okay,
rough.
yeah, the consequences of the actions kind of come right up there.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. Like, that's a good point to set expectations.
Yeah, I think sometimes people want to do, I hope this isn't a spoiler at this point, like the Madoka thing. Like, oh, I'm going to start off like really cutesy and sweet and then do a hard left turn into the dark stuff. And that takes practice, I think. And it also takes a certain medium. I don't think
Yes.
webcomics is that medium, actually. I think because you have to read them over the course of several years if it's a long form story. Like, you do want little hints, and even if you watch Madoka, that's they do give you quite a few tonal hints before like the cutesy stuff kind of goes by the wayside. So
Mm-hmm.
like, I think that's a really good skill to cultivate for your own comic, integrating elements, thinking of scenes, and thinking of ways to show what you want to show. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's just kind of the hallmark of a good writer,
Yeah.
as opposed to somebody who maybe doesn't look like they know what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's the kind of this I guess this era right now that we're going through where a lot of writers think that it's really good writing when you make something that readers can't predict, and they're kind of obsessed with going in that direction. I'm finding it a lot in like the video games industry, the movies, I mean TV shows. It's just a thing right now, and that's not necessarily a good thing, to be quite honest. Um, I think that when you're kind of clear with the indication of what we're kind of going for, that's, in my honest opinion, a little bit better. I mean, like we've said in the aesthetics episode, like that can lend into it. So you do have all these like indicators, like you were saying, Delphi, with like Madoka and how they kind of be like, "Ooh, there's a potential for something to turn," and I think I appreciate that. As far as like warnings and content is concerned, it is in that similar vein where you do have something kind of indicating that this is who the story, or this is the audience it was intended for.
Yeah, definitely along those lines. I think it might get confusing to some people that the difference between a twist and shock, just shocking your audience because it's just so out there and
Yeah,
so out of the blue. That can be a twist, but it's not necessarily a good one.
yeah, yeah, 100% agree there. And I think that's when you're going to kind of go into some murky waters, because when you have something that is that alluring, that has that kind of turn, like honestly, Madoka is such a great example of that, because when people try to get you to watch that anime, it's like, oh, things turn at episode 3, and like it's a good kind of allure to that thing. Whereas opposed to where it's like, you have someone, it's like, oh yeah, character dies and it's crazy twist or something. I don't know. There was just a certain way that it's done that doesn't feel like I'm trying to specifically shock the audience, but you're trying to convey like this is what it's about. You know what I mean? And then after that shock happens in Madoka, it's like, oh, we're continuing with this atmosphere. We're continuing with this narrative that you've laid down. So that becomes the expectation. So when we talk about like warnings and whatnot, like when it's something completely out of left field, it gets tricky when you kind of have some kind of expectation. And I know that we did cover that. I know I keep saying this in the aesthetics episode, where you have like an art style or something that won't match with like the content that you have, and it can be very jarring and actually kind of hard to describe who the potential audience that's for. And with that, I did want to ask Delphi your opinion on what rating you gave Somnolus, and how did you broadcast that to your potential audience?
So, Somnolus, I always wanted to keep a little bit light. I wanted to keep it mostly. There are some darker feelings. There are some heavier, like emotions. I did find it really helpful when I was starting to go to conventions to kind of work that into my pitch, because for a PG comic or a young adult comic that looks like it might be okay for kids, you'll get a lot of parents walking up to you and asking you, "Hey, is this okay for kids?" And even sometimes when it's not really clear from the cover of your story that they need to research a little more. They're at a convention, there's a million things
Mm-hmm.
dragging their attention. They're going to try to go to this panel in 15 minutes and they don't have time to really do the research. So you have to have a snappy way of describing what your rating is for kids specifically. And there's a couple ways to do that in a convention setting. You can have other things on your table that sort of help you along with that broadcasting your
Yeah.
aesthetic, like exactly like Miranda was talking about. You have the first scene of your comic that does that, but the experience of your booth can also do that. We're not really talking about necessarily conventions here, but when parents ask me, I say, it's magic, sword fighting. I used to say, it's Harry Potter level, because that was a story and a mood that people could kind of understand. Like, okay, I'm okay with my kid reading Harry Potter. There's scary stuff in there. Magic and sword fighting are monsters. So if that's all it is, then it's fine. I want to find a different analogy, maybe Percy Jackson now. I'm not sure, because it just leaves a bad taste in my throat to say
Mm-hmm.
Harry Potter now. But it did work for the purposes of letting parents know what kinds of ratings to expect.
Mm-hmm.
I had another friend who used to use P for Pixar. So just like, oh, it's got a lot of fun stuff, but it's also gonna hit you in the feels sometimes. So I kinda liked that one. That's a fun little rating. But yeah, I don't tend to do very heavy stuff if I start going down that direction. Because I was a child of anime. I was a child of 90s anime. Some of that stuff could get really dark and really weird. So sometimes if I'm not watching my own tone, I'll start to veer into that section. It's like, okay, what if there's this betrayal and mind control things happen and blah 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 blah. Whoa, scale it back, Edgelord. So that's
Delphi After Dark.
Delphi After Dark. I have many facets, okay? Um
Oh
but
gosh.
yeah, that's where I go with Somnolus. I think it works out for the most part. I do like to keep it mostly family friendly, but with the nuance that you're a savvy reader and you want to pick up on it. And it really does bring me a lot of joy when someone's
Mhm.
like, I read this with my kid all the time. My kid is so excited about this,
Oh,
and it's just like
that's warm fuzzies right
it
there.
it's
Yeah.
so beautiful. Yeah, so I do try to keep it, something that doesn't go into hard, gritty mafia, noir, whatever. Um, but nothing wrong with going in that direction either. I think, like we're saying, it's all about how you broadcast it.
And I think like hearing both of your answers to that really kind of hits home with the fact that you really need to understand who you're writing for and your audience for that. And I think that's a great example with the fact that you're saying to use comparative works to kind of give a feel, especially at like convention settings, or like, one to one, like places that you can actually actively talk about your comic, your work a little bit more to a more captive audience or curious, is to use some of that as a crutch. When you're describing your comic, you say, like, oh, blah, 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 here's the tiny, like, elevator pitch for it. And then, when there's more questions about it, like, oh, okay, like, you can go into that comparative stuff. You can be like, oh, well, if you really enjoyed anime X, you might like this and stuff like that. So I like that as also an indicator of tone and the content inside of it. I think that's a really good way to kind of understand what you're going for, because one of the magical things about indie comics, indie work in general, is that you can do so many things and you can go into so many different doorways with how you write, and of course that leaves you ample space and room to kind of explore a lot of things. So just kind of understanding, like, where's the boundaries, where can I stop, where should I continue to go to, and who is this ultimately for. With that, I did want to ask, what actually is a content warning and how do you keep them helpful, Miranda?
So for me, a content warning informs a reader or consumer of potentially uncomfortable topics, which vary for everyone, but some common ones are excessive gore, excessive violence, anything that can cause trauma, or PTSD type stuff, and anything like that. There's obviously a whole bunch of triggers, and everyone has their own trigger. It's impossible to list them all, but those are some main ones. And it's either like in a general rating of your comic or story or movie, or it's by page or by episode. A lot of content creators on like webtoons or their webcomic will just have at the top of their page or the episode, this episode contains XYZ, and you're aware of it for the rest of that episode. I personally find them helpful. Like we've discussed, if the topic that is happening is completely different from the current tone of the story. If I'm
Mhm.
reading something super lighthearted, very rated G, very childish, and suddenly there's an intense gory violence scene, I mean, it's not going to bother me, but I'm going to be very confused, and
Mhm.
you may get worse reactions from readers that aren't me. And you'll probably shock a lot of them, and it will likely be in an unpleasant way. Obviously, there's times that can work, but I think it's more of an exception than a rule. And even in movies and games and shows that do this, they all have like movies. The one I can think of, because we said P for Pixar, S for Sausage Party. It's a cartoon. It's about talking food. You think it could be rated G, but it is definitely not, and it has its pre-established rating that lets you know, okay, this isn't a kids movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly into the movie, you find out exactly why it is not a kids movie. So even if you plan on doing that, setting a rating from the start, you don't have to spoil anything. You just say, hey, this is not a kid's story. Then that's enough of a content warning to like let them know, okay, this isn't going to be kid friendly. I may not know why, but it'll be less of a shock when it happens.
I'm going to
Yeah.
start calling comics that, S for Sausage Party.
Claire might have issues with that, but it's okay. We might have to content warn that we're using Sausage Party in context for her, so she's
Poor
not like
Claire.
triggered or anything like that. Love you, Claire.
Gosh, it is true though. I do like the precedent of like kind of taking what movies do and be like, oh, like these are the ratings that you do, general, PG-13, and so on and so forth. It's something that I personally take when I write our stuff. I think of, you know, what I would have been reading as a kid, like Full Metal Alchemist, and watching Trigun or reading Trigun. Either different experiences, but I digress. I think of that experience and I think, okay, how old was I? How old was the demographic that they shot for? And what is the kind of story, the content that I'm going for? And I aim it towards that. And then that would be my general kind of like indicator, like, oh yeah, like Ghost Young Sickness is for like teens 14 and up. And don't read this if you're a baby. And then for Lunar Blight, it's gonna be a higher rating.
And we're all so excited for it. I'll say it. But I will say, like, the movie industry has done the effort of coming up with this rating system that is
Mhm.
pretty understood universally.
Yeah.
You might as well use it,
Yeah.
or at least use it as a guideline.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that like one of the things that I personally think that writers should avoid is when you overlabel and you start to spoil points. It kind of is personally for me a turn off when I'm going through stuff and it says there's going to be a death next page, and I'm like, what? Oh, why here? Why'd you tell me now? Okay. And it takes you right out of the story. So understanding that general notion of like, does my comic support this random death and how it is done? Or is this like completely out of left field and I'm actually writing like Caillou and horrible things happen or
Caillou.
something? I couldn't think of anything. But something just horrible out of left field happens and you're just like, I wonder. But it's always about understanding your audience, I think.
I'm just emphatically nodding in agreement at the too many things are listed here.
Yes. Yes.
Well, actually, for me, like if I see like more than 10 content warnings or something on like a thing, I'll just assume that you don't actually know what the actual impactful things in your comic are. I will think you're lying, because I've seen so many people who are like, content warning for blood, and okay, I guess there is sort of like a trickle of anime blood there. That is it's like if you were doing a scavenger hunt. Think of this as the scavenger hunt method, right? So you're going through the comic and you have to find 3 examples of blood, no matter how small they are. It's just like that's the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law.
Yes.
And one of my things is the context matters. We could describe any Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner cartoon as extreme animal cruelty, but we don't. And the reason is that we have a collective understanding about how that violence is treated, and that it won't be interpreted the same way as actual animal cruelty.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically in Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, there's some actual rules that they follow about these cartoons to ensure that we don't read the constant exploding and wall smacking is violent.
Well, yeah. Isn't it like one of them that Coyote only ever hurts himself? Like
Yeah,
no one else ever hurts him?
he only ever
It's
hurts
all
himself. He could
self-imposed.
back off at any time. If he backed off at any time, it would be okay. And he would be fine. But because he keeps persisting, that's why the violence happens. And
Mhm.
it's so interesting because comedy, especially slapstick, really does have a lot of very boring and rigid sounding rules that we consciously or subconsciously follow to make
Mhm.
sure that we're getting funny tone and not a horrific tone.
Yes.
Yeah, so watch out for that. Don't over label your things. Yeah, it's not helpful to someone who wants to engage with your work to have to go through this bombardment because if they won't think anything of it if they don't have many triggers, but if they do, they might think this is way worse than you intended.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And as I think more about this, like there's a lot of different kind of words that are very much thrown around in the community. Some hopefully uplifting and educational, whereas others start to get a little bit watered down and misunderstood too. Obviously, the word triggers is something that has been unfortunately mishandled in a lot of places. And a content warning isn't necessarily that either. And it's not for that all the time as well. So, like you two have said, it's very circumstantial. But I did want to ask Delphi, since we're kind of going around this, we've answered a bit what content warnings are. Like, what's the difference between a content warning or censorship or stuff like that when you start getting those two like meddled?
Yeah, they do get meddled. I think, especially in the day and age of social media apps, specifically on your phone, like TikTok or Tapas or Webtoon or
Hmm.
whatever, because they have rules that will ban or restrict your content automatically if you have words like die instead of unalive or show body hair or weird things like that. They'll mark it as adult content
Oh, wow.
and yeah, we've got stories from friends about
I
their
just thought the
comics.
unalive thing was just like internet talk because
No,
people
it
were
came
funny. I
from
didn't know it was
TikTok.
required somewhere.
It
Really?
it came from
Yeah.
TikTok because if you speak the word "die" in your recording, your video, you will get restricted. You will get banned because you're talking about death.
All right.
So people came up with this funny way around it. They'll say "unalive." So
Gosh.
somebody
Okay.
should
That makes
unalive
sense.
themselves or whatever. And it's still
Oh,
the same thing. It's actually a little more creepy to me,
yeah.
but you have to remember that those rules do not exist to protect people. They
Yes.
exist to protect the company. They are there so that some parent doesn't see their little Stacy looking at a post that they don't like for whatever reason and sue the company.
Hmm.
And it may have the side effect of keeping minors from seeing adult content, but it is overkill and it can also affect queer content. And that's on purpose. This is
Yeah.
a financial decision on their part to restrict your language and your imagery because that is cheaper for their company than facing lawsuits or getting in trouble with the Apple Store or getting
Yeah.
pulled from the Apple Store. That's a threat for them, especially for apps. That is it. And as indie creators, we do not have to borrow these terminologies, these
Yes.
restrictions on our own platforms. It's also one of those things where because we're marketing for ourselves and because we're a little more direct about reaching out to our own audiences, sometimes when we use too many euphemisms or put little asterisks in place of vowels so that the word doesn't get caught, the people who actually use tools to block these words that relate to the subjects that they don't want to see are forced to see them because
Yes.
you messed up their restriction, their blacklist. You messed up their filters. And so really be careful with that. If you're finding yourself restricting things or using euphemisms or different words or spelling things with an O instead of or a zero instead of an O, whatever, that's all derived from censorship, not content warnings. And if you're posting on a platform that does have that kind of censorship, follow the rules if you really want to stay on that platform, but don't do it to yourself thinking this is actually helping actual readers, because we're not
Yeah.
stupid. We know that die spelled with a 1 instead of an I means the same thing, and
Yeah.
it'll have the same effect on me regardless. So just don't do it to yourself, and think about what effect that will actually have.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I think that that's just the reason why we decided to tackle such an episode like this, is because I see a lot of things kind of seeping into like the indie community that shouldn't actually be there. I mean, the whole point of this is that we have a lot of freedom to tell the stories as raw and emotional as we can. Of course, understanding the audience and who you're writing for so that it actually reaches those people. But also at the same side, like, being as freeing as and as true as you possibly can be, because these stories are unique that way. And I think that a lot of the intensities with certain things and emotions and whatnot that sometimes do get warned and honestly, unfortunately, censored in the ways that Delphi was described, it's definitely a kind of a scary future for some of it. So, being aware of the power that you have, because you do have the power, especially when you have like control of where you're posting your stuff to. You are the master of the universe, and I would definitely take control of that situation there. As far as that is concerned, I did want to ask now, what's your advice to someone who's having like a really hard time wrapping their brain around how to rate or warn about the contents of their comic, Miranda?
So consider if what you're trying to rate or warn about is completely different from your usual vibe and tone. Find examples of media that have tropes or scenes or things that are similar to yours, and see how they approach their warnings. Like maybe if you have other web comics in the same genre, you can kind of see how they handle their content warnings, movies, TV shows, whatever. And as has been said, take the time to figure out who your audience is, or who you're intending them to be. If you're intending your audience to be children, you need to be a lot more careful with what you're including in your comic and what you're warning about. Whereas if you're intending your audience to be adults, you don't have to be as intense about your warnings and the content you're actually providing.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely agreed there. It's again just hammer back to like knowing who you're writing for. Um, and I
Yes.
wouldn't have you writing something like Caillou and then all of a sudden it's like berserk style gore or something
Probably
crazy.
don't do that unless that's your goal, then have at it, and
Yeah, if
you'll be great,
yeah,
probably.
if that's the hook, the tonal shift from Caillou to Berserk was the hook, then I guess go for it. You'll be known, and then people will understand the vibe. But
It's well, it's interesting too, because a lot of times it comes up with children or youth friendly comics and swear words.
oh yeah,
Should you be dropping F bombs in a children's comic? And that's a little more where you might want to censor yourself a bit. I think
hmm
the rule around showing stuff for kids is, can the kid easily repeat whatever you're showing them? Like,
yes,
can a kid easily repeat like throwing somebody in the ocean and drowning them? Probably.
Well,
Um,
we hope.
a kid repeat F-bomb multiple times all the time, and they won't
Yeah.
necessarily know the context in which that'll get them in trouble. So that's the
yes,
reason why you might want to scale that back. I do see quite a few comics that they would be perfectly fine for a kid's audience, but they insist on trying to put curse words in there where I don't necessarily think they're necessary. Not necessary.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think they're particularly necessary, and I don't know that they add anything to the narrative. I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of creative ways you can get around swearing that won't raise somebody's radar or hackles and say, you know what, I was gonna buy this, but it just has this one word that bothers me.
Yeah.
Um, and stay true to your vision if it really, really matters, but a lot of times it doesn't. I'm
Yeah.
just going to say that. A lot of times your work is not actually better for having the F bombs. So,
It's true.
but it would be if Caillou went berserk.
I think it would be warranted in that. And if anyone does decide to take that route, let me know, because I want to see how it turns out.
Next Screen Tones collaboration.
Oh my God.
But that's such a good point, Delphi. And like, thinking about that, I did have some conversations with a few folks. I'm just like, what's the overall content? Oh, like what happens in your story? Oh, well, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm just like, okay, well, that's comparable to like a Disney film. That's comparable to like, it gets as quote unquote dark as like something in the feel zone of a Pixar film. And I'm just like, why not broaden your audience instead of alienating them by having this one random stuff that doesn't add to anything, unless of course the rest of it supports it and it's like, oh yeah, Caillou does drop the F-bomb, but that's because that's because Caillou murders someone 2 pages later.
Yeah. Keep with your tone shift. I guess.
I'm sorry.
Your fault. You brought Caillou into this.
I did. Oh,
It was too dangerous.
it was so dangerous. But like Miranda's saying, keep with your tone. And that in itself is an excellent tool to tell people what it's about. Like even the art alone too, like if your hook isn't to be like some dramatic turnaround kind of thing, the unfortunate side effect of the Madoka where people were like, I want cute but also dark. I think that's good. Like, have that kind of general vibe about it, and so that it doesn't become a laundry list, because it can be a huge turnoff and very intimidating when you go to read a comic and you see that the content warning is there's a lot. The description is shorter than the amount of content warnings happening in the comic, and that can be a huge turnoff because, like Delphi was saying, if it's not a highlight in the comic and it's just kind of listing off these things, it becomes a scavenger hunt in the wrong way. Like it's not fun to be like, oh my god, there's blood and gore, but the blood comes from like a bloody nose and the gore was from a tooth falling out, I guess.
Al
And it
Gore.
wasn't. Yeah. Oh gosh. From that though, so like keeping in mind, like when I think of like my stuff, because I like action and violence, I guess, and my stuff does have a lot of violence in it. It is one of those things that we put in, like, Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight will have violence in it, and it's just a general thing that happens all the time, so of course it's going to be like in one of those things that happens. But I wouldn't put like Ghost Junk Sickness has bombs. No, there's bombs in it. I don't know, something that's, I don't know, puppies. No, it doesn't. I don't know.
Space travel.
Space travel. I mean, it does have that. I'm trying to think of like something it hardly has, but it's there.
No.
But regardless, I don't know my story, but it's there.
Cannibalism?
You know what? That's a great example. I wouldn't put like Ghost Junk Sickness has cannibalism as one of the content warnings, because that's like a plot point and it's not like a forever thing. It, well, kind of is.
Or
but anyway,
is it?
Yeah. I'm being called out. Oh God.
Canceled.
I'm switching right to you, Delphi. You gotta
Yeah.
answer this question.
Okay. Well,
Oh, God.
um, if your readers are adults, they already know what they can and can't engage with. So my advice is to respect the reader and know that they'll know what they want to take the chance to read. Speaking for myself, my tolerance for sensitive topics is going to change based on the specific art styles used, based on the amount of time the plot spends on that topic, based on how the characters react to the topic, and sometimes things that are completely out of the creator's control, like my mood or whatever else is going on in my life. And there's no way to expect a creator to know or cater to that. And again, just speaking for myself, web comics are actually some of the easiest things to read, despite what my tolerance levels are. They're
Mhm.
way easier than movies or TV, in my opinion. And there's a couple reasons for that. I can reduce the browser size so that the imagery isn't as big and bold and in my face if it's something that's very graphic. I can skip pages or I can scroll real fast. I can control basically the pace, which I would never be able to do in a movie or TV. And if the subject overstays my tolerance levels, I can come back later once the plot has moved on. So instead of spending a week with that page, I could read it all in one chunk.
Mhm.
I could also get a friend to read it and tell me what happened, because webcomics are free to access. So literally anybody willing to give it a read can do so and just fill me in on the relevant plot points and uh, cater their language to whatever I need. So if I want to say, is there animal cruelty in this, they can say, this is what happens, and I can move on with that.
I
Um,
was just thinking of animal cruelty and the the dogs, like dogs dying. That gets me every time.
Mhm.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I don't feel it should be content warned because it's a very specific thing. But if you have something specific like that, there are often resources. Like there's a website dedicated to telling
Does
you
the dog
if the
die?
dog dies in a show or a movie. So if you have something very specific and you fear that that might come into play in whatever you're reading or watching, there's probably somewhere out there that you can, like, if, like Delphi said, have a friend read it for you, or there's
Mhm.
probably somewhere on the internet that you can find if what you're fearing will happen happens.
I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know if there is necessarily for web comics
Yeah, maybe
because
not
we're
for
so
web comics
yeah,
yet.
but doesthedogdie.com is very good when there is literally no way I want to take a chance engaging with that topic.
Mhm.
Um, but for me also, most of the time the things that bother me aren't even listed, aren't even possible to list, because it's a tone, it's a mood, it's a style. Again, just how the comic treats that topic.
Yeah.
Um, an assault can be treated so many ways, and you don't necessarily know how the author is going to go about it unless they
Yeah.
signal to you in the tone of their other stuff. So, like, if it's a kind of dark comic, if it's post-apocalyptic something or another, and I've seen other things, I've seen kind of violence, and then somebody says, okay, there's assault in this chapter, I can kind of get a picture of, okay, I know about the level, I could see a couple ways this could go,
Mhm.
and that's how I know if it's going to be okay or maybe not okay for me.
Mhm.
But it's just you have to respect the reader. You have to respect that the reader is an adult and they're making their own choices. And if at any time they need to stop reading their comic, guess what? Nobody ever died from stopping reading a webcomic. There are so many other webcomics out there that you can read. And if you find that yourself that you are a reader who maybe is expecting your creators or the creators of the comics you like to try to cater to you, that
Mhm.
isn't a creator's job. Actually, that's your
Yes.
job. you,
Yep.
you know yourself. There's no way they can possibly know every single reader that they engage with or that they reach out to. And when you need to step away for your own health, that's what you do as an adult.
Mhm.
That is what you do. And kids don't always know this yet. They don't always have the tools for this yet, but this is part of being an adult, is curating that experience for yourself and walking away when you need that space.
Yeah. And I
Mhm.
think that thinking about that, I'm looking back at like what you said about respecting the reader. And I think that when you give that like power to them for them to decide, that's way much more respectful than kind of that laundry list that actually gives more anxiety. I remember speaking to some fellow creators, and there was a lot of anxiety when you see such a long list of things that could be potentially hazardous in these stories. And a lot of people actually avoid that. They say when the list is too long and it looks like there's everything in there from the dictionary, I can't engage with that. And, you know, you find out when you look at the comic, you're like, oh, it's not even prominent. It's not even a huge part of it or anything like that. And you've lost all these potential readers because you were like over careful or you were overcompensating for that. And, you know, there are ways to feel disrespectful, kind of adding too much and assuming, which is one of the biggest things, is assuming that people don't have agency to have and curate their own space. There's actually a lot of tools for people to do that they do go for, and they do understand to curate their own spaces, and navigate things that may be difficult for them because, like, they've lived with it. It's their lives, their experiences, and they know a stranger on the internet can help. But to be presumptuous and curate their spaces like how you think should be curated, it's overstepping too. So with that said, kind of touching base on this, I do think that has definitely been a chicken salad Caesar wrap with that. I've been your host, Crispy, and you can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com and lunarblight.com.
And I have been Delphina. You can find my comic Sombulus at sombulus.com.
And I'm Miranda. You can find my comic on intotheswellcomic.com.
Content winning toasters.
Toasters! Flying toasters.
I could go for some
Yes.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. Want to know some other ways to support us? Check out our Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/screentonescast, where your support will help us create more episodes, reach cool extra bonus goals, and keep us talking about anything and everything webcomics. You can also find us on Tumblr, Instagram, and our Discord server. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, rating, and supporting, and we'll see you next time.